Montana Territory, 1879. The wide-open skies stretched endlessly above Benson Forrester's land, 600 acres of promise that felt more like a prison with each passing day. The 25-year-old rancher stood on his porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of amber and gold. His cattle operation was growing, his modest ranch house was finally completed, and by any reasonable measure, he'd carved out success where many had failed. Yet as night fell across Whispering Creek Valley, the silence of his empty home reminded him of what he'd come to believe. The frontier demanded everything and gave little back, especially to those foolish enough to seek companionship in such unforgiving country. "No point in wanting what you can't have," Benson muttered to himself, adjusting his worn Stetson as he headed toward his barn. 6 years on his own had taught him self-reliance but also hardened something inside him. His parents' disastrous marriage back east had driven him westward at 19, determined to build something that couldn't crumble beneath the weight of false promises and broken vows. Love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford, not when survival required every ounce of focus and determination he possessed. The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Benson rode into Cottonwood Springs, the nearest town to his spread. Though only 10 miles from his ranch, he made the journey as infrequently as possible. Towns meant people and people meant complications. Better to handle his business efficiently, supplies, mail, and perhaps a quick meal at the hotel restaurant before returning to the predictable company of his cattle and horses. As he tied his horse outside the general store, the sound of raised voices drew his attention. 3 women stood on the boardwalk, their expressions cold as they addressed a 4th woman who clutched a small valise to her chest. Even from a distance, Benson could see the hurt etched across her youthful features. "Decent folk don't want your kind here, Sarah Fleming," one of the older women said, her voice carrying down the street. "Your father's reputation was bad enough, but after what you did." "I've done nothing wrong," the young woman answered, her voice soft but steady. "Those were lies, Mrs. Whitaker, and I believe you know that." Benson tried to look away, to mind his own business as he always did, but something about the quiet dignity in her posture kept him rooted in place. Sarah Fleming couldn't be more than 20, with honey-blonde hair pulled back in a simple style. Her blue calico dress was neat but worn, and though her eyes glistened with unshed tears, she held herself with remarkable composure. "The stage leaves tomorrow," another woman added. "I suggest you be on it." With that, the trio swept past her, leaving Sarah alone on the boardwalk. For a moment she remained still, then squared her shoulders and entered the general store. Almost against his will, Benson found himself following her inside. The store owner's expression soured at her approach. "Miss Fleming, I've already told you." "I can pay," she said quietly, placing a small purse on the counter. "I just need enough supplies until I can find work elsewhere." "And I told you we don't need your business," the man replied, pushing her money back across the counter. "My wife won't stand for it." Color flooded her cheeks. "Mr. Daniels, please, whatever you've heard." "We've all heard enough," the man interrupted. "Best move along." Benson had seen enough. Something about the casual cruelty directed at this young woman stirred something in him, anger, yes, but also a strange protectiveness he'd never felt before. "I'll be paying for the lady's supplies," he said, stepping forward, "along with my own." The storekeeper blinked in surprise. "Benson, you don't want to get mixed up with." "I don't recall asking for advice on my associations," Benson replied, his voice deceptively calm though his heart hammered in his chest. "Now are you interested in my business, or should I ride to Silver Creek for my supplies this month?" Sarah turned to face him, her hazel eyes wide with surprise. "You don't need to do that, sir." "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But I've found this town can be unreasonably harsh in its judgments." He extended his hand. "Benson Forrester." "Sarah Fleming," she replied, hesitantly accepting his handshake. Her fingers were slender but surprisingly calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard. An hour later, they sat across from each other at the hotel restaurant, an awkward silence between them as Sarah stared into her coffee cup. "You didn't have to buy me lunch," she said finally. "The supplies were generous enough." "Seems the least I could do after witnessing such poor hospitality," Benson replied. He studied her face, noting the light dusting of freckles across her nose and the wariness in her eyes. At 20 years old, she seemed both younger and older than her years, a vulnerable youth mingled with a hardness born of difficult experiences. "May I ask what brought you to Cottonwood Springs?" Sarah sighed. "My father died 3 months ago. He was not well regarded here, a gambler with a talent for making enemies." "I'm sorry for your loss," Benson said. "Thank you," she replied. "He wasn't always a good man, but he was my father. After he passed, I came to settle his affairs and found myself unwelcome. Then when I sought work as a schoolteacher," she trailed off, her expression darkening. "There was an incident with the banker's son. He made advances I refused, and he created a story about me that spread through town like wildfire." "And they believed him without question," Benson finished, familiar with how frontier towns operated. Reputation was currency, and once lost, nearly impossible to regain. "Yes," her voice was steady despite the hurt evident in her eyes. "I've been trying to save enough to leave, but no one will hire me, and now I can't even purchase supplies." Benson surprised himself with his next words. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Fleming." Her expression immediately turned guarded. "Sir, if you're suggesting—" "No, nothing improper," he hastened to add, feeling his ears grow warm. "My housekeeper left last month to care for her sister in Denver. I need someone to manage the household while I tend to ranch business. Room, board, and fair wages." Sarah studied him skeptically. "Why would you offer employment to someone the entire town has condemned?" It was a fair question, and one Benson wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "I've never put much stock in town gossip," he said finally. "And I judge people on their actions, not rumors. Besides," he added with a small smile, "I've always found it wise to form opinions counter to whatever Elias Daniels believes." For the first time, Sarah's lips curved into a genuine smile, transforming her face completely. Something shifted in Benson's chest at the sight, a dangerous feeling he quickly suppressed. "I should warn you, Mr. Forrester, that associating with me might damage your standing in town." Benson shrugged. "I keep to myself mostly. The ranch is 10 miles out and I rarely socialize. My cattle don't much care about social standing." Sarah considered his offer for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I accept your proposition, Mr. Forrester. Though I should warn you that while I can cook and clean reasonably well, I'm not trained as a housekeeper." "Honesty is a good start," Benson replied, relieved for reasons he couldn't quite identify. "We leave in an hour if that suits you." The ride to Whispering Creek Ranch was largely silent, but not uncomfortably so. Sarah rode beside him on a gentle mare Benson had purchased for his previous housekeeper, her meager possessions strapped behind the saddle. As they crested the final rise before his property, Benson felt a sudden self-consciousness about his home. It wasn't grand, a sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, flanked by a barn, bunkhouse, and various outbuildings, but he'd built most of it himself. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly as they approached, her gaze taking in the valley with its creek and the mountains rising beyond. "So peaceful." Pride warmed Benson's chest. "It's taken years to build it up, but it's coming along." He showed her to the housekeeper's quarters, a comfortable bedroom off the kitchen with its own small sitting area. "Make yourself at home. There's no rush to begin working, you can start tomorrow." "Thank you, Mr. Forrester," she said, setting her valise down carefully, "for everything." "Benson," he corrected. "If we're to share a household, formality seems unnecessary." She nodded, a flicker of something like relief crossing her features. "Benson then, and I'm Sarah." That evening, Benson found himself uncharacteristically restless. The presence of another person in his home, especially a young, attractive woman with troubled eyes and a gentle smile, disrupted the careful isolation he'd constructed around himself. He'd convinced himself that loneliness was the inevitable cost of independence, that connections brought only complication and eventual disappointment. Yet as he sat on his porch watching the stars emerge, the sound of Sarah moving about the kitchen brought an unfamiliar warmth. It was dangerous to acknowledge this thawing sensation in a heart he deliberately kept frozen, and Benson resolved to maintain appropriate distance. She was his employee, nothing more, and he would do well to remember that. The following weeks established a rhythm neither had anticipated. Sarah proved herself not just competent but exceptional in managing his household. The house transformed under her care, becoming truly habitable rather than merely functional. Meals appeared at regular hours, his clothes were mended and cleaned, and small touches, wildflowers in mason jars, curtains hung in windows that had been bare for years, made the ranch house feel like a home for the first time. More surprising was Sarah's interest in the ranch itself. She asked thoughtful questions about the cattle operation, learned the names of each horse in his stable, and even requested to learn basic ranch skills in case I'm ever needed in an emergency, she'd explained. One evening in late May, Benson returned from a long day mending fences to find Sarah on the porch, a book open in her lap though her gaze was fixed on the distant mountains. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Sarah smiled, closing her book. "I was just thinking how different everything is here. In town I felt hunted, constantly watched and judged. Here I can breathe." "The mountains have a way of putting human concerns in perspective," Benson agreed, watching the way the setting sun gilded her hair. "Makes our problems seem smaller." "Is that why you stay so isolated?" she asked, her question gentle but direct. "To keep your problems small." The question caught him off guard. In their month of cohabitation, they'd developed an easy companionship, sharing meals and occasional conversations, but neither had probed too deeply into the other's past or motivations. "Partly," he admitted after a moment, "and partly because people are complicated. Out here, things are simpler. The work either gets done or it doesn't. Animals either thrive or they don't. There's honesty in that. And you don't find honesty among people." Benson considered her question. "Rarely. My parents' marriage was built on lies and obligation. My father gambled away my mother's inheritance while telling her they were prospering. My mother pretended to love him while secretly despising everything about him. By the time I left home, their dishonesty had poisoned everything." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "That must have been difficult to witness." "It taught me that some things aren't worth the risk," he replied, more sharply than he'd intended. To his surprise, Sarah laughed softly. "Says the man who brought home a woman the entire town had condemned." The observation struck him silent. She was right. His impulsive offer of employment had contradicted everything he claimed to believe about keeping his life uncomplicated and free from entanglements. "That was different," he said finally. "That was just decency." "Was it?" she asked, her hazel eyes searching his face in a way that made his heart beat faster. "Or was it proof that you're not as resigned to isolation as you claim to be?" Before he could formulate a response, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. 3 riders were making their way up the path to the ranch house, and Benson immediately recognized Sheriff Potter from town, accompanied by 2 men he didn't know. "Stay inside," he told Sarah, rising from his chair. "Let me handle this." The sheriff dismounted with a grunt, his expression grim as he approached the porch. "Evening, Forrester." "Sheriff," Benson acknowledged. "What brings you out my way?" Potter gestured to the men behind him. "This here is Marshal Davis from Helena, and this is Oliver Fleming." Benson felt a chill at the surname, even before the younger man stepped forward. He shared Sarah's coloring but none of her warmth. His eyes were cold and calculating as he surveyed the ranch house. "We're looking for my sister," he said without preamble. "Sarah Fleming. Word in town is you've been harboring her." "I wasn't aware that employing a housekeeper constituted harboring anyone," Benson replied evenly. "Miss Fleming works for me, yes." The marshal stepped forward, his expression grave. "Son, I don't think you understand the situation. We have a warrant for Sarah Fleming's arrest on charges of theft and fraud in Helena. Her brother here has been tracking her since she fled with their father's estate." Shock and disbelief warred within Benson. He thought of Sarah's gentle manner, her work ethic, the quiet dignity with which she'd faced the town's condemnation. The allegations seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman he'd come to know. "There must be some mistake," he began, but fell silent as the door opened behind him and Sarah stepped onto the porch. Her face had drained of all color, but her posture remained straight, dignified. "Oliver," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I should have known you would find me eventually." "Hello, sister dear," Oliver replied, his tone falsely sweet. "You've led me on quite a chase." The marshal cleared his throat. "Miss Fleming, I have a warrant for your arrest. You're charged with stealing $5,000 from your father's estate and defrauding the First Bank of Helena." Benson turned to Sarah, searching her face for denial, for explanation, for anything that might make sense of the situation. She met his gaze steadily, though tears had begun to gather in her eyes. "It isn't true," she said simply, "but I have no way to prove it." Oliver laughed coldly. "The bank records and witnesses say otherwise, Sarah. Father left everything to both of us, but you decided to take it all. Just like you always did, Father's favorite, the precious daughter who could do no wrong. Your father's will left the estate to be divided equally," the marshal added. "But the bank account was emptied 2 days after his death, and you disappeared shortly after." Sarah's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "Because you threatened me, Oliver. Because when I discovered what you'd been doing with Father's gambling debts, you swore you would destroy me if I didn't leave quietly." The accusation hung in the air, but Oliver merely smiled. "More lies from a desperate thief. Marshal, I think we've heard enough." As the marshal stepped forward to take Sarah into custody, Benson made a split-second decision that would alter the course of his carefully isolated life forever. "I'll stand surety for her," he said, moving to place himself between Sarah and the lawman. "Whatever bail is required, I'll pay it. My ranch is worth considerably more than $5,000. The marshal hesitated. "This isn't a local matter, Forrester. She'd have to stand trial in Helena." "Then I'll accompany her to Helena and ensure she appears for trial," Benson replied, surprising himself with his vehemence. "But I won't let you take her to jail tonight based on accusations I find highly suspect." "You barely know my sister," Oliver said, his eyes narrowed. "Why would you risk your ranch for her?" Benson met Sarah's astonished gaze. "Because in the month she's been here, she's shown more integrity than most people I've known my entire life, and because your story doesn't add up." After tense negotiations and the signing of legal documents putting his ranch as collateral, the marshal agreed to leave Sarah in Benson's custody until the trial date in 3 weeks' time. The men departed with warnings and Oliver's thinly veiled threats, leaving Benson and Sarah alone on the porch in the gathering darkness. "Why did you do that?" she asked when the riders had disappeared from view. "You've risked everything for someone you barely know." Benson struggled to articulate the certainty he felt. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know you're not a thief, and I know your brother was lying. I could see it in his eyes." Sarah sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "He was always jealous of Father's affection for me, but I never thought he would go this far. After Father died, Oliver told me he'd been managing Father's gambling debts by embezzling from the bank where he worked. He said if I didn't leave quietly, he would frame me for his crimes." "And that's exactly what he's done," Benson said grimly, sitting beside her. "But why not tell someone? Why accept the town's condemnation instead of fighting back?" "Who would believe me over him? Oliver is respected in Helena, assistant bank manager, church deacon, city council member. I'm just a gambler's daughter," she wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Besides, I had no proof. I still don't." "Then we'll find some," Benson said with more confidence than he felt. "We have 3 weeks until the trial." Sarah looked at him with wonder. "Why would you help me? You've already risked your ranch by standing surety." The question forced Benson to confront feelings he'd been avoiding for weeks. The truth was that Sarah's presence had awakened something he'd thought long dead, a capacity for trust, for connection, for seeing beyond his own carefully constructed walls. "Because you make me want to believe that not everyone disappears or disappoints," he said quietly, "and that's worth fighting for." The following days transformed both their relationship and Benson's understanding of himself. Together they prepared for the journey to Helena, developing a strategy for gathering evidence of Oliver's duplicity. Sarah's knowledge of her father's business dealings and her brother's habits provided clues to where they might find proof of his embezzlement. What Benson hadn't anticipated was how this shared purpose would dissolve the remaining barriers between them. Working side by side, planning their approach, Sarah's intelligence and resilience shone through her previous reserve. She no longer deferred to him as an employer but challenged his ideas and offered alternatives. In turn, he found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he'd kept buried for years. "My mother wrote to me once after I left home," he confided one evening as they sat before the fire. "She said my father had finally gambled away the last of their property and disappeared. She asked if she could come live with me, but I refused. I was so angry, so determined not to repeat their mistakes that I turned away my own mother." Sarah's hand covered his. "What happened to her?" "She went to live with her sister in Boston. She died 2 years later." The admission released a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I never saw her again, never apologized for abandoning her when she needed me." "You were protecting yourself," Sarah said gently. "We all do what we must to survive." "But at what cost?" he asked, looking into her eyes. "I've spent 6 years building this ranch, telling myself it was enough, that independence was worth the solitude. And then you arrived, and suddenly everything I thought I wanted seems incomplete." The confession hung between them, too honest to retract, too vulnerable to ignore. Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "I was running too," she admitted. "Not just from Oliver's threats, but from the pain of never feeling I belonged anywhere. My father moved us constantly, always one step ahead of his creditors. I never had a home, never had friends who lasted. I learned not to want those things. And now—" her smile was tentative but real. "Now I find myself wanting what I shouldn't, a place to belong, a home that isn't temporary." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "People who won't disappear." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Benson leaned forward, drawn by something stronger than his fear, but stopped himself. First, they had to secure her freedom. Anything else would have to wait. "We should get some rest," he said, reluctantly withdrawing his hand. "We leave for Helena tomorrow." The journey to Helena took 3 days, during which their plan took clearer shape. Sarah knew that Oliver kept private ledgers separate from the bank's official records, documents that might contain evidence of his embezzlement. Their challenge would be gaining access to those records without alerting him to their investigation. Helena proved to be larger and more imposing than Benson had expected, a proper city with brick buildings and paved streets. They took rooms at a modest hotel near the courthouse, careful to maintain propriety despite the growing closeness between them. "Oliver keeps his personal papers in a safe in his home office," Sarah explained as they walked through the city, familiarizing themselves with its layout. "He's meticulous about locking it, but he keeps the key on his watch chain." "So we'd need to get his key without him knowing," Benson mused, already seeing the impossibility of the task. "Or find someone who could open a safe without one." Sarah's expression brightened. "I might know someone. Father had a friend, Thomas Walsh. He was a locksmith before he turned to gambling. He helped Father open a safe once when he lost the key." They found Walsh in a rundown boarding house on Helena's east side, an elderly man with rheumy eyes and trembling hands who brightened considerably at the sight of Sarah. "Little Sarah Fleming," he exclaimed, ushering them into his small room. "Last I saw you, you were no higher than my elbow. Your father spoke of you often." "Mr. Walsh, I need your help," Sarah said, explaining their situation and Oliver's scheme. "We need to access his safe to find proof of what he's done." The old man listened gravely, his weathered face hardening at the mention of Oliver. "I never liked that boy. Too smooth by half and cruel when he thought no one was looking." He nodded decisively. "I'll help you. These old hands aren't what they used to be, but I can still feel a lock's mechanism well enough." Their opportunity came 2 days later. Through discreet inquiries, they learned that Oliver would be attending a bank dinner that would keep him occupied for several hours. With Walsh's guidance, they approached Oliver's handsome townhouse after dark. "This is breaking and entering," Benson muttered as Sarah produced a key to the back door. "We could end up in jail alongside your brother if we're caught." "I still have my key," Sarah replied. "Technically, I'm a legal resident since Father's will left the house to both of us." Her expression was determined. "If you want to turn back, I understand. This isn't your fight." Benson shook his head. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone." Inside, the house was silent and dark. Sarah led them to Oliver's study, a masculine room dominated by a large desk and bookshelves. The safe stood in the corner, a substantial iron box with a combination dial. Walsh approached it with reverence, pressing his ear against the metal as he slowly turned the dial. For nearly 20 minutes, the only sound was the faint click of the mechanism as the old locksmith worked his magic. Finally, there was a decisive clunk and the safe door swung open. Inside, they found exactly what they had hoped for. A leather-bound ledger containing detailed records of money moved between accounts, funds from the bank diverted to cover gambling debts, then replaced with money from their father's estate. Most damning of all were letters from creditors addressed to their father, but with notations in Oliver's handwriting indicating how he had settled each debt after his father's death. "This proves he took the money, not you," Benson said, carefully gathering the evidence. "He used your father's estate to cover his embezzlement." "We need to take this to the marshal immediately," Sarah said, her voice shaking with relief and vindication. They were so focused on their discovery that none of them heard the front door open or the footsteps approaching the study until it was too late. The door swung open to reveal Oliver, his expression shifting from surprise to cold fury as he took in the scene before him. "Well, well," he drawled, stepping into the room. "Breaking into my home, Sarah, how desperate you've become." His gaze shifted to Benson, hardening further. "And you've dragged your rancher into your crimes." "How touching." "The only criminal here is you, Oliver," Sarah replied, her chin lifted defiantly. "We've found your ledgers, we know what you did with father's money and how you've been stealing from the bank." Oliver's hand moved to his jacket, producing a small pistol that he leveled at them. "I don't think anyone will be taking that information anywhere. In fact, I think I've just discovered burglars in my home." His smile was chilling. "Self-defense is well within my rights." Benson moved to place himself between Sarah and the gun. "Think carefully, Fleming. Shooting us won't solve your problems. The marshal already has suspicions, or he wouldn't have granted surety instead of immediate imprisonment." "A regrettable error in judgment I'll have to discuss with him," Oliver replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Now place those documents on the desk and back away." What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion. Walsh, who had been forgotten in the confrontation, swung a heavy brass paperweight from the desk, striking Oliver's arm just as he fired. The shot went wild, splintering the bookcase as Benson lunged forward, tackling Oliver to the ground. The gun skittered across the floor, and Sarah quickly retrieved it while Benson subdued her struggling brother. The gunshot brought neighbors and minutes later, the town constable. With the evidence secured and multiple witnesses to Oliver's attempted murder, the situation rapidly reversed. By morning, Oliver was the one in jail, charged with embezzlement, fraud, and attempted murder, while Sarah was formally cleared of all charges. "The bank is conducting a full audit," Marshal Davis informed them the following day. "It appears your brother has been embezzling funds for over 2 years. Given the evidence and his actions last night, I expect he'll be facing a significant prison sentence." Relief washed over Sarah's face. "Thank you, Marshal, and I'm sorry for the trouble." The marshal nodded grimly. "Miss Fleming, I owe you an apology. I should have investigated more thoroughly before issuing that warrant." He tipped his hat to Benson. "You were right to stand by her, Forrester. Not many would have taken such a risk." When they were alone again in Sarah's hotel room, the full impact of their ordeal finally hit her. She sank onto the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "I can't believe it's really over." Benson knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "You're free now, you can go anywhere, do anything you choose." Sarah looked at him, her tear-stained face vulnerable yet hopeful. "What if what I choose is to return to Whispering Creek Ranch, not as your housekeeper, but—" Benson prompted, his heart hammering against his ribs. "But as something more," she finished softly. "These past weeks, working together, facing danger together, they've shown me that what I want most is a partnership. A home that's built on trust and honesty, not secrets and fear." Benson reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. "I've spent 6 years convincing myself I was better off alone, that connections only led to pain. Then you arrived, and suddenly everything I believed was called into question." "And now," she asked, her eyes searching his. "Now I know that the risk of loving someone is nothing compared to the emptiness of never trying." He drew a deep breath, gathering his courage. I love you, Sarah Fleming. I think I began falling in love with you that first day on my porch when you looked at the mountains and said you could finally breathe. Sarah's smile bloomed through her tears. I love you too, Benson Forrester. You saw me when everyone else looked away. You believed in me when even I was beginning to doubt myself. He rose, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. Their first kiss was tender, a promise exchanged without words of trust given and received, of a future built together rather than apart. 2 weeks later, they returned to Whispering Creek Ranch as husband and wife, married by the circuit preacher in Helena with old Thomas Walsh as their witness. The town of Cottonwood Springs received the news with mixed reactions, surprise, disapproval, and eventually, as the truth about Oliver's crimes spread, grudging acceptance. Benson expanded the ranch house that summer, adding rooms for the family they both hoped to have. Sarah, with her portion of her father's recovered estate, invested in additional cattle and land adjoining their property. Together they built something neither had dared to imagine before, a true partnership founded on mutual respect and unwavering support. On their first anniversary, they sat together on the porch where their journey had truly begun, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar gold. Any regrets? Benson asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Sarah, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their child grew, smiled up at him. Only that we wasted so much time being afraid. Not wasted, he corrected gently. We needed that time to become the people who could recognize each other when we met. As darkness fell over Whispering Creek Valley, the ranch house glowed with warmth and light, a beacon in the wilderness that had once seemed so empty and unforgiving. Inside those walls, two people who had once believed themselves destined for loneliness had found what the frontier so often denied, not just survival, but a chance to truly live, to love without reservation, and to build a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. For Benson Forrester, who had once believed the frontier was no place for love, the greatest discovery was not the gold in the mountains or the wealth in his expanding herds, but the simple truth that home wasn't a place at all. It was the person who made even the harshest landscape bloom with possibility. And for Sarah Fleming Forrester, who had spent her life feeling unwanted and cast aside, the most precious gift was belonging completely to someone who saw her exactly as she was and loved her without condition. Together, they had taken the greatest risk the frontier offered, not of life or fortune, but of opening their hearts when everything in their experience warned against it. And in that risk, they found the truest reward. A love strong enough to weather any storm, vast enough to fill the endless prairie sky, and enduring enough to outlast the very mountains that witnessed its beginning.